The war had been going on for 3 long years, and Captain Jake Morrison was tired of seeing death everywhere he looked across the burned landscape of Outpost. Meridian, where his small team moved carefully through the ruins, searching for any signs of enemy activity or useful intelligence that might help end this terrible conflict between humans and the mysterious elf people called the Sylvari Empire, who controlled vast regions of space with technology that seemed like magic to humanize Jake. Led his team of 5 soldiers through the smoking wreckage when Lieutenant Kate Brennan suddenly raised her hand to signal everyone to stop and be quiet because her scanner had picked up something unusual ahead in the rubble and debris that covered what used to be a supply depot before the Sylvari attack destroyed everything and everyone stationed there just 2 days ago, leaving nothing but twisted metal and ash behind. Moving forward slowly with weapons ready, Jake spotted the crashed ship, half buried under collapsed building materials, and recognized it immediately as a Sylvari scout vessel with its distinctive silver hull that seemed to shimmer even when covered in dust and damage from the violent crash that must have happened during the attack or shortly after, when the pilot tried to escape but failed to make it back to their own territory. Safely, Kate whispered that they should call it in and let the recovery teams handle the situation because approaching enemy vessels was dangerous even when they appeared abandoned, since the Sylvari were known for leaving traps and defensive systems that could kill anyone who got too close, but something made Jake ignored the standard protocols and approached the wreckage anyway. Following an instinct he could not explain even to himself, inside the crashed ship, Jake found her lying in the pilot's seat, barely breathing, with blood that looked almost silver spreading across her uniform and the strange armor she wore that bore symbols Jake had seen in intelligence briefings about Sylvar nobility and possibly even royalty, which meant this was not just any soldier, but someone important to the enemy leadership. Structure. Her eyes opened when Jake knelt beside her, and those eyes were unlike anything he had ever seen before, with colors that shifted between violet and gold. She struggled to focus on his face and recognized that a human soldier had found her in this vulnerable state, when by all rights he should have either killed her or taken her prisoner according to military regulations, and the bitter hatred that fueled this war. Kate came up behind Jake and urged him strongly to leave the elf woman behind, or at minimum restrain her and call for extraction teams to take her as a valuable prisoner who could provide intelligence. It's about enemy movements and plans, but Jake found himself unable to walk away from those eyes that held so much pain and fear, mixed with a strange kind of hope that seemed to reach out to something deep inside his own heart. He made the decision that would change everything and started using their limited medical supplies to stabilize her wounds. Even though he knew nothing about elf biology and was essentially guessing based on what worked for humans, while praying that their species were similar enough that his efforts would help rather than harm. This dying woman, whose name he did not know, the young elf woman whose name was Lyra, suddenly gasped, and her body went rigid as Jake attempted to seal a major wound in her side, and without warning, a wave of pure mental energy exploded outward from her unconscious mind, slamming into Jake with the force of a physical blow that sent images and emotions flooding through his thoughts. In a chaotic storm of memories that were not his own, Jake saw glimpses of a vast palace made of living crystal growing from trees larger than mountains, and felt the weight of responsibility that Lyra carried as the crown princess of the Sylvari Empire and daughter to Queen Seraphina, who ruled with absolute authority over billions of subjects across dozens of worlds. And he understood in that moment that he had just saved not merely a soldier, but the heir to the enemy throne. When the psychic storm finally subsided, Jake found himself on his knees gasping for air, while Kate and the other soldiers stared at him with concern and confusion written across their faces, because they had not experienced what he just went through and could not understand why their captain looked like he had just survived a battle, despite standing perfectly still beside the unconscious elf. Princess Lyra opened her eyes again, and this time she was fully aware and conscious enough to speak, in a voice that carried an accent Jake had never heard before, as she said that he had sealed his fate by saving her life and touching her mind during the rescue, because her mother, Queen Seraphina, did not forget debts owed to her family, nor did she ignore those who witnessed royal secrets that were meant to remain hidden from outsiders, especially humans, before Jake could Ask what she meant by that cryptic warning. A sound like thunder rolled across the ruins, and the sky above them seemed to tear open as something massive descended from the clouds, moving with impossible grace despite its enormous size. And Jake recognized the creature from classified intelligence reports that most soldiers dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. The dragon was real, and it was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, with silver scales that reflected the sunlight like mirrors and eyes that burned with intelligence far beyond any animal as it landed near the crashed ship with a gentleness that contradicted its size and power, while folding wings that seemed too large to be possible according to any laws of aerodynamics that human scientists understood. The dragon, whose name Jake would later learn was Astherian, fixed its ancient gaze directly on him, and Jake felt that same psychic pressure he had experienced when Lyra's defenses activated, except this time it was controlled and deliberate as the dragon examined his mind and memories to understand exactly what had happened, and why a human captain had chosen mercy over Dutios Therian. Made a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite speech, but somehow Jake understood it as approval, or at least acceptance, before the dragon carefully gathered Lyra in one massive, clawed hand with a tenderness that reminded Jake of a parent holding a sick child, and then with one powerful beat of its wings, the dragon launched into the sky and disappeared into the distance, leaving Jake and his team standing in shocked silence. Colonel Amy Peterson was furious during the debriefing when Jake reported what had happened, and she made it clear that he had potentially compromised their entire position by wasting medical resources on an enemy combatant and then allowing a high-value target to escape without even attempting to take her prisoner or eliminate her before she could return to enemy lines with knowledge of human troop movements and capabilities. Jake accepted the formal reprimand and the mark on his service record, but he could not bring himself to regret his decision, because something fundamental had shifted inside him during that brief psychic connection with Lyra, and he knew with absolute certainty that the war was far more complicated than simple territorial conflict between two species fighting for control of the Outer Rim territories. 2 months passed since Jake saved the elf princess, and life returned to the grinding routine of war with patrols and skirmishes and the constant threat of death that hung over every soldier serving in the Outer Rim. But Jake could not forget the Silver Dragon's knowing gaze or the way Lyra's warning had sounded like both a threat and a promise of something larger than he could understand. He threw himself into his duties, leading his unit through dangerous territory and trying to push away the strange dreams that came to him at night, where he saw the Crystal Palace and felt Lyra's presence somewhere far away, as if the psychic connection they had formed during the rescue had not fully broken despite the distance and time that now separated them across the war-torn regions of space. Everything changed on a routine patrol near the neutral zone when Kate's communications officer picked up a signal that should not have existed because it was broadcasting on human military frequencies, but coming from a silvery vessel that appeared on their scanners alone and unguarded, which violated every tactical doctrine both sides had established during 3 years of bitter conflict. The message was simple and terrifying, as a calm voice speaking perfect English without any accent stated that Captain Jake Morrison was summoned to appear before Queen Seraphina of the Sylvari Empire, and he must come alone and unarmed within 3 days or face consequences that would reshape the entire war in ways that neither side could predict or control. Jake immediately reported the message to command, and within hours the entire military leadership structure was debating what it meant and how to respond, because nothing like this had ever happened before in the history of human and Sylvari relations, and no one knew if this was a genuine diplomatic overture or an elaborate trap designed to capture or kill a human officer who had somehow earned the attention of the enemy. Queen Admiral Claire Hammond wanted to use the situation as an opportunity to launch an ambush on the Sylvari diplomatic vessel and capture it for study, because such ships were rarely seen and never vulnerable but intelligence officer. Beth Carver argued strongly that attacking a diplomatic mission would violate every rule of war and potentially escalate the conflict to levels that humanity might not survive. Jake sat through the debates and arguments feeling a growing certainty that this summons was real and that he needed to accept it despite every logical reason to refuse, because the memories he had glimpsed during Lyra's rescue kept surfacing in his mind, showing him things he should not know about Silvery culture and politics, including the fact that Queen Seraphina did not make idle threats or empty gestures against direct orders from Colonel Amy Peterson, who forbade him from accepting what she called a suicide mission. Jake made the decision to steal a shuttle and head to the coordinates provided in the message because something deep inside him understood that refusing this summons would have consequences far worse than any personal danger he might face by going alone into enemy territory. Kate tried to stop him at the shuttle bay and volunteered to come with him, but Jake refused because this was his responsibility and his burden to carry alone, and he would not risk anyone else's life for a choice that might be remembered as either the greatest act of courage or the most foolish mistake in human military history. The journey to Silvari space took Jake through regions he had only seen on star charts and tactical displays as he piloted the small shuttle past destroyed stations and debris fields that marked major battles from the early years of the war, when both sides still believed they could win through superior firepower and tactical brilliance. As Jake approached the coordinates deep in Silverari-controlled territory, his scanners picked up 3 large contacts moving to intercept, and he felt his heart race as he recognized the signatures as dragons, each one slightly smaller than Stherian but still massive and deadly, with riders in elaborate armor who guided their mounts with an ease that spoke of lifelong partnership between elf and dragon. Dragon riders did not attack, but instead formed an escort around Jake's shuttle and guided him toward a planet that should not have existed according to everything human scientists knew about planetary formation and stellar mechanics, because it orbited too close to its sun, yet maintained an environment that looked impossibly lush and green from spacey Thermor. Was the capital world of the Silvari Empire. And as Jake's shuttle descended through the atmosphere, he saw forests of trees that grew miles high, with trunks wider than human skyscrapers and cities, made of living crystal that pulsed with light and energy that seemed to flow through them like blood through veins, creating architecture that blended nature and technology in ways that human engineers could only dream about. The escort brought Jake to the largest tree he had ever seen, with roots that dove deep into the planet's crust and branches that reached so high they disappeared into the clouds and built into. And growing from this massive world tree was the royal palace, with walls that shifted between solid matter and pure light, while towers spiraled upward following the tree's natural growth patterns. Jake landed his shuttle in a courtyard where hundreds of Silvari guards waited with weapons that looked like works of art, but he knew from combat reports were deadly beyond anything humans had developed. And as he stepped out of his ship wearing his uniform, but carrying no weapons, as instructed, he felt the weight of countless eyes judging him and wondering why their queen had summoned this human who should have been their enemy. The guards escorted Jake through corridors that seemed alive with flowing patterns of light and color, while the walls showed glimpses of distant places and times that he could not fully understand, as if the palace itself existed partially in another dimension where space and time followed different rules than the material universe humans knew and explored. Finally, they brought him to the throne room, and Jake stopped breathing for a moment as he took in the impossible space before him, with a floor that reflected not the room but distant galaxies and walls that shifted between solid crystal and pure energy, while at the center stood a throne carved from a single massive dragon scale that radiated power and authority. Queen Seraphina sat upon that throne, and she was both beautiful and terrifying, with silver hair that moved like living water and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom and cruelty of countless centuries, watching civilizations rise and fall across the galaxy while she remained eternal. An unchanging Princess Lyra at her mother's right side, fully recovered from her injuries but changed somehow, with a new awareness in her eyes that found Jake immediately across the vast throne room, and for a brief moment he felt their psychic connection flare to life again, carrying a message of warning and apology and something else he could not quite identify behind. The throne Asterion coiled his massive body with wings folded and eyes fixed on Jake with that same penetrating intelligence that had examined him during their first encounter, and the dragon's presence filled the room with barely contained power that made the air itself seem to vibrate. With potential energy, Queen Seraphina spoke, and her voice carried absolute authority. As she stated that Jake had performed an act that should not have been possible according to Sylvari law because a human touching royal blood and working what amounted to magic through technology should have triggered Lyra's defenses and killed him instantly, yet he survived and saved her life when he could have claimed glory through her death. The queen continued speaking, while Jake stood before her, feeling the weight of her ancient gaze, measuring every aspect of his character and finding him somehow both lacking and acceptable at the same time in ways he could not fully understand, but felt deep in his bones as if her judgment carried consequences that extended beyond his own life into the future of his entire species. Seraphina explained that Jake's action presented her with a dilemma because by the old laws of the Sylvari Empire, any human who touched royal blood should be executed immediately to prevent contamination of the sacred bloodlines that had ruled for 10,000 years, yet he had not merely touched Lyra but formed a psychic bond with her during the rescue, which created obligations that even a queen could not easily dismiss. She began to reveal truths that Jake had never suspected and could barely comprehend as she spoke of ancient history stretching back long before humans left their homeworld and ventured into the stars where they encountered the Sylvari Empire. Its territory they began expanding into, without understanding what they were truly awakening from its long imprisonment. The queen stated that the war between humans and Sylvari had never been about conquest or resources or the simple clash of civilizations competing for the same space, but rather about preventing humanity from breaking ancient seals that held back creatures called the Voidborn, who came from Lee. Dark space between galaxies where normal matter and energy could not exist, and life itself was an aberration to be consumed. Jake listened in growing horror as Queen Seraphina described how the Voidborn had nearly destroyed all life in the galaxy 10,000 years ago, before the elder races, including the Sylvari, managed to trap them using technology and magic that modern civilizations had long forgotten, and those seals were placed in specific locations throughout the galaxy, including several in the Outer Rim territories where humans now built mining colonies and research stations. Sylvari had attacked human positions, not to drive them away, but to prevent them from accidentally or deliberately breaking the seals through ignorance or scientific curiosity, because human technology, particularly or quantum drilling methods, created vibrations and energy patterns that weakened the ancient containment systems without anyone realizing what they were. Queen Seraphina revealed that her military advisors had wanted to simply exterminate humanity before they could become a threat, but an ancient prophecy spoke of children of iron and fire who would either save or destroy the elder races, and the queen had chosen to test this prophecy through war, hoping that humans would prove strong enough to become allies rather than victims. When the Voidborn inevitably broke free, Jake felt his understanding of the war completely transform as he realized that both sides had been fighting for the wrong reasons, or at least without knowing the full truth about what stakes were actually involved in this conflict, and how close they had come to unleashing something that would make their territorial disputes seem meaningless. Queen then spoke of what happened during Lyra's rescue and how Jake had somehow survived the princess's psychic defenses, which should have been impossible, because humans were not supposed to have any natural resistance to Sylvari mental attacks. Yet Jake had not only survived, but formed a bond that allowed him to glimpse memories and share emotions in ways that normally required years of training, and genetic compatibilization shifted behind the throne and made a sound that Jake somehow understood as confirmation that the dragon had examined Jake's mind during their first meeting and found something unexpected there that marked him as potentially significant to the prophecy about the children of Iron and Fire. Queen Seraphina stated that Jake's act of mercy, witnessed by Asterion and validated through Lyra's survival, created a debt that bound the royal family to him, but also revealed something the prophecy had suggested might be possible, which was that only through uniting human innovation with Sylvari ancient power could the Voidborn be defeated permanently, rather than simply imprisoned against them. Queen offered Jake an impossible choice that would define not only his own fate, but potentially the future relationship between humans and Sylvari, as she explained that he could return to his people and deliver her terms for peace. negotiations, knowing that his own military would likely brand him a traitor or collaborator who had been compromised by enemy influence. Alternatively, Jake could remain with the Sylvari as living proof of human good faith and work with their scientists and scholars to find a way to reinforce the failing seals. Before the Voidborn broke free, while both civilizations attempted to forge an alliance that neither side truly wanted, but both desperately needed, Jake asked how he could possibly make such a choice, when he knew nothing about the Voidborn or the seals, or whether anything the Queen had told him was even true rather than an elaborate deception designed to turn him against his own people. And she smiled for the first time, showing teeth that were slightly too sharp to be human. Queen Seraphina commanded Lyra to show Jake the truth, and the princess stepped forward with reluctance clear in her eyes as she reached out and took his hand, creating an instant connection that was stronger and clearer than what they had shared during the rescue. Because this time, Lyra was conscious and in control of what she revealed. Images flooded Jake's mind, showing him the Voidborn in all their terrible glory as creatures that existed partially outside normal space-time and fed on life force and consciousness itself, leaving behind husks that could not live or die, but remained trapped in a state of horror that made death seem like mercy. He saw the ancient war 10,000 years ago, when the Sylvari and other elder races fought desperately against the Voidborn invasion, and how billions died before they found a way to trap the creatures using technology that combined physical science with psionic power in ways that required perfect cooperation between different species with different abilities. The visions showed Jake the seals and how they were failing faster than anyone had predicted, with perhaps only months remaining before a catastrophic breach occurred that would release the Voidborn in numbers that neither humans nor Sylvari could hope to contain using conventional military force. When the connection finally broke, Jake found himself on his knees gasping for air while Lyra steadied him with a hand on his shoulder, and he looked up at Queen Seraphina and stated that he would stay because preventing the Voidborn from awakening was worth any personal sacrifice he might have to make. The Queen nodded as if she had expected this answer and told Jake that he would work with Princess Lyra and a joint research team that included both human and Sylvari scientists, who had already been recruited because the Queen had been preparing for this possibility. Ever since Asterion reported what happened during the rescue, Jake was assigned quarters in the palace and given access to information that would have made him the most valuable intelligence asset in human military history if he had chosen to return home. But instead he focused on understanding the threat they faced and how human technology might combine with Sylvari abilities to create new solutions. Over the following weeks, Jake met the research team, including Dr. Lisa Morgan, who was a human scientist that had defected after discovering classified documents, proving that Earth's military command knew about the Voidborn threat, but had chosen to continue the war anyway because they believed they could find and weaponize Voidborn technology before the seals failed. There were also Sylvari scholars who had been exiled for suggesting that the prophecy about children of iron and fire offered salvation rather than doom, and who believed that human and Sylvari working together represented the galaxy's best hope for survival against the coming darkness. Jake worked alongside the research team day and night, studying the ancient seals and trying to understand how Voidborn containment technology functioned, because the science involved concepts that human physics could barely explain, and the Sylvari magical components required psionic abilities that humans simply did not possess naturally. Darlisa Morgan proposed that human quantum drilling technology, which had ironically been weakening the seals, could be modified and combined with Sylvari psionic binding to actually reinforce the failing containment systems, but the process would require unprecedented cooperation and trust between the two species who had spent 3 years trying to kill each other. The research team built a prototype device in a secure facility on the outskirts of the Crystal City where they could test their theories without risking damage to the palace or the civilian population, and Jake spent long hours working with Lyra to understand how their psychic connection might serve as a bridge between human technology and Sylvari power. Progress came slowly but steadily as the team learned to combine their different approaches, and Jake found himself becoming more comfortable with the strange sensation of Lyra's presence at the edge of his thoughts, while she learned to appreciate humans' stubborn determination to solve problems through trial and error, rather than relying on ancient knowledge. Everything fell apart on the day they were scheduled to conduct their first full test of the prototype because a radical faction within the Silvery military led by General Velthrin staged a coup, believing that Queen Seraphina had been compromised by human influence and that Jake was a spy. Using the princess to infiltrate their highest levels of power, General Velthrin commanded a significant portion of the military, including 3 full dragon flights and numerous ground forces who believed that cooperating with humans violated the sacred duty of the Silvari to protect the elder races from the younger civilizations who lacked wisdom and respect for ancient laws. The same moment the coup began, a human Black Ops team led by Commander Rita Shaw infiltrated the planet using stealth technology that the Silvari had not encountered before, and Rita was Jake's former mentor who had trained him years ago before the war began, and she arrived with orders to extract or eliminate him, depending on whether he was viewed as a hostage or a collaborator. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence, and Jake realized that there must be factions on both sides who wanted to prevent any possibility of peace or cooperation because they benefited from the war continuing, or because they genuinely believed their species could handle the Voidborn threat alone, without needing help from their enemies. The coup forces and the extraction team collided at the research facility where Jake and the team were preparing for their test, and the violence erupted without warning as Silvari soldiers loyal to General Velthrin attacked the guards protecting the facility, while human commandos breached from the opposite direction. Creating chaos and confusion, Jake tried to protect the prototype device while Lyra used her psionic abilities to defend against the attackers, but in the confusion and fighting, someone damaged the power systems, causing a catastrophic feedback loop that activated the device without proper calibration or safety protocols. The prototype was designed to reinforce seals, but instead, it created a brief opening in the nearest containment system, and through that opening something emerged that made everyone in the facility stop fighting. As primal terror overwhelmed their training and discipline, the Voidborn entity was small compared to what the ancient records described, but it radiated wrongness that made reality itself seem to twist and bend around its form, as if the universe was trying to reject its presence but could not quite succeed in forcing it back into the darkness between stars. It moved impossibly fast, killing 3 Silvari guards in seconds by touching them and draining their life force until they collapsed as empty husks. While the entity grew slightly larger and more solid with each victim it consumed. 2 human soldiers fired their weapons, but the bullets passed through the Voidborn without effect because it existed partially in another dimension, where physical matter could not easily interact with its substance, and conventional weapons were useless against something that was only halfway present in normal space. Jake felt the psychic connection with Lyra flare to life stronger than ever before, as they both instinctively understood that their bond might be the only advantage they had, because Jake could resist the mental assault the Voidborn projected, while Lyra had the psionic power to potentially harm it if she could focus her attacks through someone who was immune to its influence. They reached for each other across the burning facility and clasped hands, creating a circuit that allowed Lyra to channel her power through Jake's natural resistance to psionic attacks, while he directed her energy toward the Voidborn entity like a living weapon, combining human determination with Silvari ancient magic through their linked minds. They called out to Asterion, who had been circling the city during the attack, and the dragon heard their plea, responding with a speed that made the air scream as he dove toward the facility and crashed through the roof with claws extended and fire building in his throat. The dragon's attack, combined with the focused psionic assault that Jake and Lyra directed, drove the Voidborn back toward the breach it emerged from, but not before the creature lashed out with one final desperate strike that touched Jake's arm where his sleeve had been torn away during the fighting. Cold, unlike anything Jake had ever experienced, spread from the point of contact, racing up his arm and across his chest as the Voidborn essence infected him with energy that his body should not have been able to contain, because humans were not meant to host the darkness that existed between galaxies. The creature finally fell back through the breach, and Dr. Lisa Morgan managed to seal the opening using emergency protocols, but the damage was done as Jake collapsed with the infection spreading visibly across his skin like black frost that pulsed with unnatural light. Both the coup and the extraction attempt failed in the aftermath of the Voidborn attack because General Velthrin was killed by the entity before it was driven back, and Commander Rita Shaw found herself working alongside Sylvari soldiers to save lives rather than capture or kill. Jake, as her orders had specified, Rita knelt beside Jake as Lyra held him, and the commander looked at her former student with tears in her eyes because she could see the infection spreading and knew that no known medical technology, human or Sylvari, had ever found a cure for voidborn contamination. Lyra refused to accept that Jake was dying, and she maintained their psychic connection even as he lost consciousness, because through their bond she could feel his human stubbornness. Fighting the infection in ways that should not have been possible in his body, was trying to adapt rather than simply shutting down as any Sylvari would have done. Queen Seraphina arrived at the destroyed facility with Assyrian and surveyed the carnage with cold fury, because the attack had killed dozens of her people and revealed that there were traitors on both sides willing to sacrifice everything to prevent cooperation between humans and Silver. With Queen looked at Jake dying from voidborn infection, and then at her daughter, who refused to leave his side, and finally at Commander Rita Shaw, who had tears streaming down her face. And she made a decision that would reshape the future, as she commanded that Jake be brought back to the palace where they would attempt something that had never been done before. Jake lay dying in the royal palace, while the voidborn infection spread through his body, turning his veins black and causing his temperature to drop far below what any human could survive as his heart struggled to pump blood that was being transformed into something alien and hostile to life itself. Lyra remained at his side, refusing to eat or sleep, while she maintained their psychic connection because through their bond she could feel Jake fighting the infection with a determination that defied logic and natural law, as his human body tried to adapt rather than surrender to the inevitable death that any other species would have. Accepted Queen Seraphina gathered her most skilled healers and scientists, but none of them had any idea how to cure voidborn contamination, because in 10,000 years of recorded history, no one had ever survived direct contact with the creatures, and the few who had been infected were mercy killed before the transformation could complete. Dr. Lisa Morgan studied Jake's condition obsessively and proposed a theory that seemed crazy but offered the only hope anyone could imagine. Because humans had evolved on a world far from the ancient psionic networks that connected most elder races, and this isolation meant they were essentially deaf to the psychic screaming that voidborn used to break down their victims mentally before consuming them. Physically, Lisa suggested that Jake's survival this long was not just luck or stubbornness, but rather proof that human biology could potentially resist voidborn infection in ways that Sylvari or other psionic species simply could not, because the darkness between galaxies affected minds and consciousness more than physical bodies. Commander Rita Shaw, who had chosen to remain on the planet rather than return to human space, contributed her knowledge of human medical technology and worked alongside Sylvari healers in an unprecedented cooperation born from desperation and the growing realization that Jake represented something far more important than any individual soldier. They developed a radical treatment plan that combined severe healing magic with human nanotechnology, using the psychic bond between Jake and Lyra as a conduit to channel energy and information while mapping the infection pattern in ways that neither species could have achieved. Separate Retaliation volunteered to add his own ancient power to the procedure because dragons possessed abilities that even the Sylvari did not fully understand, and the silver dragons seemed to recognize that Jake had become important to something larger than the immediate conflict between two species fighting over territory. Procedure was agonizing and dangerous as Lyra channeled healing energy through their bond, while Lisa's nanobots mapped and contained the infection at the cellular level, and Assyrian wrapped them all in its power, creating a three-way connection that merged human technology with Sylvar, magic, and dragon ancient wisdom. For 3 days Jake hovered between life and death, while his body fought to incorporate the voidborn essence rather than be destroyed by it. and the healers could only watch as something unprecedented happened, because instead of dying, Jake was transforming into something new. When he finally woke, the infection had stopped spreading, and instead of killing him, it had been contained within his system, creating a permanent connection to the darkness between galaxies that allowed him to sense voidborn presence and predict where breaches would occur. AK had become a living early warning system, neither fully human nor touched by Sylvari power, but something that bridged the gap between species while serving as a weapon against the creatures that threatened all life in the galaxy. The transformation convinced many of the hardliners on both sides that cooperation was not only possible but necessary, because Jake's survival proved the prophecy about Children of Iron and Fire working together to achieve what neither could accomplish. Alon General Velthrin's second-in-command knelt before Queen Seraphina and accepted that the alliance was required if they hoped to survive the coming battles, while Commander Rita Shaw returned to human space with data and testimony that finally convinced Earth's leadership to agree to peace negotiations. War did not end immediately because too much blood had been spilled, and too many soldiers on both sides still viewed their enemies with hatred and suspicion, but both civilizations agreed to a ceasefire and the formation of a joint military task force dedicated to hunting voidborn breaches and reinforcing the ancient seals. Jake accepted his new role as commander of the first combined fleet, which was part human warship and part Sylvari bio vessel, representing the merger of technologies and philosophies that both sides brought to the Alliance. Princess Lyra became his co-commander because their psychic bond made them uniquely effective at coordinating between human and Sylvari units, while Asterion agreed to serve as the flagship's guardian and the symbol of this new cooperation between species that had been enemies. The first mission took them to the Kepler sector, where Jake's infection warned him of an imminent breach days before it occurred, giving them time to position forces and prepare for the emergence of 3 voidborn entities that would have devastated the nearby colonies if they had gone unchallenged. The combined fleet fought together for the first time, and though the battle was difficult and casualties were high, they succeeded in driving the voidborn back through the breach and sealing it using the technology that Jake and the research team had perfected, standing on the bridge of their hybrid ship. Jake felt the mark on his skin pulse with warning as his senses detected another breach forming hundreds of light years away, and Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, letting their connection strengthen as she shared the burden of his new awareness behind them. In the specially designed chamber that served as both hangar and living space, Asterion spread his wings and roared a challenge that echoed through the hull, making the entire ship vibrate with power. As the dragon prepared for battle, the crew worked efficiently around them, mixing human efficiency with Sylvari grace as they prepared to jump toward the new threat location. And Jake gave the order, watching as human tactical officers coordinated with Sylvari navigators to plot a course that would bring them to the breach before it could fully open. This was the new reality they had created through sacrifice and compromise, where former enemies worked together against a threat that would have destroyed them both if they had remained divided. And Jake understood that this was only the beginning of a much longer war. The Voidborn would keep coming, and the seals would continue to fail until they found a permanent solution. But now they had hope, because 2 civilizations had learned to combine their strengths and trust each other despite generations of conflict. Lyra squeezed his shoulder and through their bond, Jake felt her confidence and determination mixed with affection that had grown from respect into something deeper during their time working together. Ship jumped into hyperspace, carrying soldiers from 2 worlds who had put aside their differences to face a common enemy, and as they traveled toward the next battle, Jake allowed himself a moment of pride for what they had accomplished. They had transformed an act of mercy during a brutal war into the foundation of an alliance that might save the galaxy. And though the road ahead was dangerous and uncertain, Jake knew they would face it together. The hunt for Voidborn had begun, and Captain Jake Morrison, who had saved an enemy princess and earned the respect of a dragon queen, now led the first combined force of humans and Sylvari into battle against the darkness between stars behind them. The galaxy watched and waited to see if the prophecy about Children of Iron and Fire would bring salvation or destruction. But Jake and Lyra were too busy preparing for the next fight to worry about ancient predictions, because they had a job to do and a species to save.